Okay, well, welcome everybody to the Standpoint debate, which is the first time we've done this with the Frontline Club, and we're extremely grateful to the Frontline Club, a wonderful institution, as you can see. If any of you haven't been here before, you might like to consider joining it. And I'm very much hoping, of course, that you'll also consider subscribing to Standpoint. You should all have got a copy of the latest issue, hot off the press today, on your seat. If you haven't, please ask one of our people at the back. There's plenty of other spares. And you might also, if assuming you're here because you're interested in Russia and Ukraine and all that, you might also be interested to help yourselves at the end to. We've got a few copies of the last 2 months' issues for March and April, both of which have covers on Russia and Ukraine, and articles by, respectively, Ben Judah on my left and Tony Brenton on my right, as well as other leading experts, many different angles to be considered. So do please, anyone who's interested, help yourselves. They're all at the back and they're all free. Now, the motion before us today is a very, very significant one. I don't believe it has been discussed in this way before. I think we've got ahead of all the other people who organise debates like this, including that dump down in Westminster. So what you say, what you hear today and your view of it is really rather significant. And for that reason, I'm going to ask everyone, well, if you want to, that is, to actually vote. I'd like you to have a show of hands at the beginning and then another one at the end, so we see how opinion may or may not have shifted. But before we do that, you'd better actually be reminded of what the motion is. And it is this. This House believes that Britain is more interested in doing business with Russian oligarchs than standing up to Vladimir Putin. Now, I can see that that motion could be interpreted in more than one way. You know, you might, for example, think that it's a very good thing to be doing business with Russian oligarchs rather than standing up to Putin. You might not think standing up to Mr. Putin is at all a good idea, or you might take the opposite view. But anyway, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, to raise your hands if you're in favour of that motion. I'll say it again. This House believes that Britain is more interested in doing business with Russian oligarchs than standing up to Vladimir Putin. All in favour, raise your hands. Right. Okay.
We can leave.
It's a significant proportion.
A walkover.
Now,
Come on,
who
Dan, it's
is
the overwhelming majority.
against the motion? Raise your hands up. Against the motion. Rather fewer, but still a significant number. So, I should have said before, could you please all turn off your mobile phones before we go any further to save yourselves and all of us embarrassment? Well, we're going to have questions later, but well, I think that's going to become clear in the course of the evening. So we'll park that one just for now, Ray.
It means if you vote yes, you'll be annexed into the Russian Federation tomorrow.
Well, let's proceed. Before anything else, I'm Daniel Johnson. I'm the editor of Standpoint, and we're a magazine, a monthly magazine of ideas and culture and civilization, political and cultural. We've been going for about 6 years now, and we're monthly, and you can find us in any good newsagent all over Britain and in other countries too. So that's us, and I want to introduce our speakers. On my left is Ben Judah, one of the most brilliant young writers about Russia and Ukraine on the scene at the moment, and I'm very proud of the fact that Ben cut his teeth writing for Standpoint. He still does write very frequently for us, though he now, of course, has other outlets, not least the New York Times, where he managed to cause a bit of trouble. You may even have read about that. There was reaction back in Britain. It took a little while before people realised that Ben was actually British, because he was very tough on the City of London and its involvement with Russian high finance. Anyway, Ben is also the author of Fragile Empire, How Russia Fell in and Out of Love with Vladimir Putin, which is an excellent book and again, available in all good bookshops. On my right is Tony Brenton, the former ambassador in Moscow between 2004 and 2008. He worked for 30 years at the Foreign Office. He's been awarded the KCMG, so he is officially Sir Anthony Brenton, but he prefers, I think, to be called Tony. And he's now Extraordinary Fellow of Wolfson College, Cambridge. So we couldn't ask for a more distinguished and authoritative view of Russia from the diplomatic world. Then on my extreme left, we have Roger Boys, the diplomatic editor of the Times, who started his career in Moscow and is still a regular visitor there. He knows the country extremely well, but he has also been a foreign correspondent all over Eastern Europe, Berlin and Rome. So again, a man of enormous experience and deep knowledge, and many of those unsigned leaders that you read in the Times on foreign policy will actually have come from Roger's pen. And finally, on my extreme right, entirely accidentally, is Peter Hitchens, whose reputation as a journalist, broadcaster, and author probably needs no introduction in this journalists' club. He's, of course, a columnist on the Mail on Sunday. But what you may not remember, the younger people here, was that he was a distinguished foreign correspondent in Moscow and Washington. During the 1990s, I think, was your spell in Moscow. So he witnessed the collapse and of the Soviet Union and the Yeltsin years. So Peter knows a lot about this subject and speaks on it with great passion and expertise. So I think you'll agree we have a very, very fine lineup here. And the format, very briefly, for the evening is each of our speakers will speak for about 10 minutes. Then we'll have a little discussion between them. And then I'm going to throw it open to the floor for you all to make ask your questions. I must ask you, please, not to make speeches. And if you do, I may have to cut you off. But by all means, ask questions. Indeed, I hope very much that you will. And then at the end, as I said before, we will take a final vote to see who's been the most persuasive. So without further ado, I'm going to start off with Ben Judah. Ben,
thank you.
To propose the motion.
Thank you, Daniel. I'd like to begin this discussion with what a practice borrowed from Russia, borrowed from the Russian opposition, which is to ask everyone on the panel if they have any business interests in Russia, and if they have any business ties to Russia, and then just to sort of declare them. I, last year, wrote an article for Kommersant newspaper. I was paid €400. I then wrote another one and I was never paid. Roger, do you have any?
No, I'm still waiting for offers.
The same.
Now, apart from being a secret agent of the FSB, I
So he's blown.
Oh, whoops.
But let's begin in something. Let's begin again something that we can all agree on, since we don't have any business assets in Russia, which is that the great thing about Britain is the rule of law. That what makes Britain great is the rule of law, and that British laws should not be violated. Let's have a quick explainer of how Putinism works. How Putinism works is that the regime is an asset-stripping regime which rips billions and billions and billions of dollars out of the country every year. The money is then transported out to tax havens and foreign countries, and a vast amount of this money ends up in the United Kingdom. So out of every ruble stolen in Russia, a large amount of those kopecks will end up under the Union Jack, either in Britain's tax havens, overseas territories, or in London. I'm going to put forward a very minimalist definition about how I would like Britain to stand up to Putin. I would like Britain to enforce its own laws. So what is the law? The law in this country is that if you suspect somebody of money laundering, you need to immediately report him to the police. There's only another law which is like this, which is terrorism. So if I came up to you in the street with a suicide jacket on and asked, where's the nearest synagogue, you would have to immediately report me to the police. So if I came into your estate agency with a box of
You're looking
cash,
at me.
with a box I was looking at Tonya, with a box of cash, and went, hello, I've just come from Ukraine and Russia, the money's in the car around the back in suitcases, can you take me to Kensington, please? You should immediately report me to the police. You shouldn't buy me a house. So let's drill into that law a little bit more. So if an individual turns up at your business and he is a politically exposed person in a country of rampant corruption and money laundering, these people are called in the legal terminology PEPs, and because I find it amusing, I'm going to refer to them as PEPs for the duration of this talk. If a PEP turns up from Russia or from Ukraine, if you suspect him, got to report him. But this doesn't happen. And how do we know that this doesn't happen? Let's have a look at some very dry numbers. So in 2013, the UK Financial Services Authority, before it was abolished, believed that $93 billion were laundered in London and the UK. That's $93 billion. Okay, it's a lot of money, but the police are working. What percentage of that was seized? 0.2%. The United Nations Office of Drugs and Trafficking believes that 99% of global money laundering goes undetected. And the UK has one of the most miserable records in the OECD on dealing with this. Out of OECD countries returning assets, only 0.8% of them came from the UK, and the UK froze only 0.26% of illicit funds between 2006 and 2009 in the OECD. But we're one of the biggest financial superpowers in the OECD, so those figures don't quite link up. Now, Britain's economy isn't dependent on PEPs, but certain elite sectors of the economy are PEP addicted. So let's go through and have a look at which ones they are. First one, property. 70% of super prime, high value, ultra amazing prime London property is brought by foreign buyers using offshore devices. A large amount of those are PEPs. Now the London Commercial Court, an estimated that 60% of the workload is now linked there to Russia and Eastern Europe. A large amount of those are, of course, PEPs. Now to the murkier world of PEP life in London, we have PR agencies, which are PEP addicted, due diligence, again, addicted to the PEP, London Close Protection loves the PEP, London Private Wealth Management couldn't live without the PEP. And of course, English public schools, this is the place for the junior PEP, makes 100 million a year from these individuals. Now, if you're coming from Russia and you're a PEP, what that should really mean is you're a Putin-exposed person. So how can a PEP operate? If a PEP comes here, it's against the law, if you suspect him of money laundering, that he should do any business with you. He couldn't buy a coffee off you if you had any suspicion that he was a PEP. Well, the answer is the Shell Company. So the Shell Company is another piece of British law which allows you to basically do whatever you want in this country anonymously, acting through an offshore vehicle that renders you anonymous. And one of the proofs that Britain is not interested in fighting overseas corruption on this gigantic scale is that from Blair to Osborne, any attempt coming from the House of Commons, there have been many, to get rid of shell companies has been shot down. So other people, thankfully, are looking into what role the remains of the British Empire play in global corruption. So we still have imperial territories. I'm really, really proud that when I look at the map, I take a magnifying glass and I can see little bits of pink around the world. And what these places are, pretty much without exception, they are offshores and they're tax havens. And in these places, Oxfam estimates that $7.18 billion is being held offshore. That's the global PEP fortune. So let's do an estimate let's do what trillion. Sorry, 7.18 trillion is held in these offshore charities. Sorry about that. It's a kind of a slip. I'm even more horrified now. So, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime did an analysis of 150 cases of grand corruption. It's a great name and it's a terrible crime. And they wanted to find out of these 150 cases, how many of these cases of grand corruption involve a UK tax haven. So the number is 150, and out of 150, 91 involve the British Virgin Islands, 27 the UK directly, 15 the Cayman Islands, 12 Bermuda, 12 Jersey, 7 the Isle of Man. So we've got a kind of strange constitutional arrangement with these places, but London has moral responsibility for crimes that happen under the Union Jack. So what evidence is there that London's PEP-addicted sectors are influencing policy? Well, the French foreign minister gave us a little revelation about debates going on in the EU, saying that France would sanction French armaments industries, of course very PEP-addicted in their own way, if Britain sanctioned oligarchs. It's a public statement from France on the nature of the debate within the EU. Now, so we of course have the infamous UK civil servant briefing paper, which was photographed. It was, I wonder if it was a leak, because it's a scene from In the Thick of It, in which we saw that one of the proposals to David Cameron from the UK Civil Service is that nothing should be done to harm the City of London at this stage of the crisis with Russia in terms of sanctions. Now, of course, there's not a single PEP on the EU sanctions list, whereas the American sanctions list is heavily PEP filled. Now, let's just study Number 10's awareness of the PEP problem. So I'd like to examine one politician and his friends in the PEP scene. That politician is George Osborne. So firstly, I'd like to remind you of George Osborne's famous PEP party on a yacht when he met Oleg Deripaska, and Nathaniel Rothschild accused him of having asked Deripaska to fund the Conservative Party through an offshore vehicle. So Osborne and the Conservative Party denied this, but Rothschild felt confident enough to write this in a letter in the Times. I speculate he wouldn't have done that if he hadn't been confident he could win in court. So that's a clear case of a PEP relationship. And was Osborne running when he asked that question, if he of course did, sufficient background checks on Oleg Deripaska? Well, I Googled Oleg Deripaska before coming out, and I saw that Putin refers to Oleg Deripaska as his son. So now let's move on to another PEP on the London scene. And London's most famous PEP is, of course, Roman Abramovich. I ran the same Google, and Abramovich is also referred to by Putin as his son. I then Googled Osborne Abramovich. I saw a lot of pictures from Chelsea games. So I'm very, very interested how this is going. Now let's have a look at the funding of the Conservative Party. And you have major donors who are of course UK citizens, because that's the law, who have been contributing to the party. One makes a large amount of money from dealing with Rosneft. Another one makes a large amount of money running an asset company which contains the wealth of a Russian oligarch called Mr. Friedman. So I'm just very curious whether the PEP check has happened in these companies. Now, all I'm calling for is that, British law being enforced. I'm not raising any questions apart from the law be, of course, checked. What does the government say? Well, the Cameron-Osborne government denies that any of these economic issues about the elites sectors being addicted to PEP money influences policy. And I was delighted to hear that they were going to host what they called the Big Conference. Now, the Big Conference is the Ukraine Asset Recovery Conference. And do you want to know how much money they froze? They froze £14 million. Now, this building is probably worth more than £14 million. Now, second case, which is Britain has been the Britain that I'm very proud of, and the Britain I know Peter is very proud of as well, is not a Britain that hides behind Europeans. Now, in conversations that I've been having with Number 10 officials, what they say is, well, we can't actually independently put any sanctions on the PEPs unless all other European countries do that. So I'm, for ideological reasons, very upset that Britain is in lockstep with Bulgaria and not in lockstep with the United States. I think Margaret Thatcher would be very, very disappointed about this. And now I have another conversation with the Cameron team about why there are no PEPs on the list. And what they've told me is, oh, we're very frightened that we would lose against the PEPs in court. Again, I think that's evidence of PEP addiction in UK sectors. Now let's come back to the nature of Putinism, which is, out of every stolen ruble, these kopecks are ending up here. My definition of standing up to Putinism is that we just enforce our own laws and we don't allow that to happen. We don't allow corrupt, stolen money in a dictatorship be celebrated in its arrival in London.
Thank you very much. I wondered when that mysterious document in number 10 was going to make its appearance, and it's done so already. So over to you, Tony. You know what it's like on the inside of the government. How does it look from where you sit?
Thank you, Daniel. My take on this resolution, I find myself on the pro-oligarch side of the table, as it were, was raised by Ray, is that your name over there? And I'm, in a very unhuman way, going to take it as an ought to rather than an is resolution. How ought we be relating to Russia, given what Russia is and given the current circumstances we find ourselves in? And I'm afraid this is going to be deeply incoherent. I'm going to cover a very different area of territory from what Ben has just covered. But I mean, what I see the two sides in this resolution being that side, you say we should stand up to Putin, we should be tough on the Russians, PEPs, what have you. Whereas I'm afraid my view is that, well, the line I'm going to argue is we should do business with Putin, including doing business with oligarchs and doing business with Russia in general. Now, let me be clear what I'm not arguing. As Ben has said, Russia is a deeply imperfect place. It is corrupt. It is pretty close to being an autocracy, although there are worse autocracies around the world, most notably China. And you might bear in mind as we go forward this evening, the implications of how you feel about Russia ought to have implications about how you feel about China too. It's very repressive in all sorts of ways. I've been quite heavily involved in, if you know about it, the Magnitsky campaign, where a lawyer working for a British company was killed in effect by a bunch of people in the Russian Interior Ministry for exposing a deep fraud. Actually, it's unreal against the Russian state for doing it. So very, very bad place. I know it personally. I've experienced some of the badness. So don't get me wrong as I proceed with this argument. I know very well the things that are deeply wrong with Russia. Nevertheless, as you look at Russia, well, I would add to being a bad place, we are, of course, dealing with Russia's behaviour in Ukraine, and I intend to measure on that because that is the top of the headlines at the moment. And in the eyes of many people here, that rather underlines all the problems of the Russias that we have been accommodating for so long and now ought not to be accommodating anymore. Russia was backing a deeply corrupt regime in the form of Mr. Yanukovych. It was horrified when he fell and responded by seizing the Crimea in breach of their own commitments under international law, in breach of all recent parallels and rules with regard to how European countries behave towards one another. And they are now, and I don't deny this either, quite systematically destabilizing East Ukraine. The GRU, the Russian military intelligence, are all over the place. I don't think they have the place under control, but there is no doubt that their fingerprints are all over what is going on there, and the aim of that is to apply pressure to the Ukrainian authorities to get them back into closer coherence with what Russia is looking for in life. So this is a bad country from all sorts of points of view. How do we respond? And this is, I think, the nub of the argument about Russia, really. Do we move from our policy, which up until now has been essentially a policy of engagement? Essentially, the feeling as being, yes, this is a place with lots of warts and all of that, but they had a big revolution fairly recently, 1991. They're still in a terrible shambles in all sorts of ways. They have very limited experience of democracy, rule of law, or any of those things. Therefore, we maintain business, we strengthen links in all sorts of ways. Gradually, they swing over and become more normal, become closer to being a normal member of the European family. And that has been essentially our policy, and actually all Western policy, more or less since 1991, with greater or lesser enthusiasm, but that's been it. And actually, to be fair, it's worked up to a point. Trade has grown. The market economy has become better and better established. More and more Russians are coming over here for both good and bad reasons. The links are growing stronger. And the constituency in Russia, which doesn't like the way Russia runs itself, has grown steadily stronger and stronger to the point where we saw those big demonstrations at the end of 2011, 2012. That has been the policy. The question is, have they now acted with regard to Ukraine sufficiently out of the domain of acceptable behaviour for us to seriously switch over to the Cold War policy, to the policy of containment, to the policy of sanctions? We don't talk to them, we don't trade with them, we don't let them into any organisations over which we have any control. We make them feel thoroughly unwelcome in the world community. We, in the slightly ludicrous words of President Obama and others, we isolate them. And they will feel the pain and therefore rediscover all the virtues of the model that we have to offer. And I'd like to think of this debate as being the argument about those two approaches. And in order to choose intelligently between those two approaches, I think we need to look at the world, I'm afraid, slightly from a Russian point of view. And if you look back at the Russian point of view of how they have been treated since 1991, they feel that they have been systematically neglected, humiliated, and encircled. And they feel this with a certain amount of justice. They will point to the expansion of NATO, the absorption into what they regard as a hostile Western camp, contrary to promises which they claim they received at the time that Gorbachev surrendered control over all of Central Europe and over all the rest of the USSR, contrary to promises they claim they received that these people would not be absorbed into NATO. They watched the war in Kosovo. Their friends, the Serbs, the West, with all its claims about supporting international law and all of that, going in there with the most exiguous of legal excuses, no doubt for a very good moral reason, but breaching every single norm of international behaviour for, I mean, a good moral reason. I don't deny that, but the Russians don't, on the whole, deal in moral reasons when it comes to foreign policy. And what they saw was a major breach of the system whose stability we all depend on to keep the peace. They saw the Chechnya War, a very nasty internal war where they repressed the Chechens very brutally, but they watched the West implicitly and explicitly backing really very nasty Islamic terrorists who, for example, seized the school in Beslan and were responsible for the death of 200 school children, who have blown up hospitals and what have you. And they saw the West backing these people, as I say, implicitly or explicitly, and, as the Russians saw it, backing the taking apart, the systematic dismemberment of Russia as a whole. So, for a whole bunch of reasons, they've seen themselves as being... They've seen the West as backing Russia's enemies whenever there has been a conflict of any sort. Now, all of this comes together in Ukraine. You look at Ukraine, we look at Ukraine, it's a long way away, and there's not many people that I talk to really know exactly where it is. Famous joke. Let me tell you a joke. The story is that someone says to President Putin, you know, those Americans are so ignorant. 64% of American college graduates can't find Ukraine on a map. To which Putin replies, and very shortly no one will be able to. I just... Sorry, and that doesn't make my case at all, but nonetheless, I couldn't resist it. You come to Ukraine, you come to the country which the Russians see as closest to them, civilizationally, in terms of history, in terms of culture. Kiev, of course, is the mother of Russian cities, the core of the spread of the Orthodox religion. Half of Ukraine is, well, ethnically Russian is a questionable thing, but it's very close, was part of the Russian Empire since quite a lot of it the 17th century. Even Crimea, where we've just seen what's happened, was joined in the 18th century. And with very strong economic links as well, some of which are quite important to the Russians. So I quite regularly, when I talk about Ukraine, Russia, the comparison is England-Scotland. It's that relationship, it's that close, that vexed in some ways as well, but the two countries are historically linked and bound in that way. And the Russians see the West having done Kosovo, done NATO, failed to turn up to the opening of the Sochi Olympics, another minor, but nevertheless real act of contempt for all of them having gone to Beijing 2 years before. So this isn't about human rights. This is about Russia. They see the West having taken over Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Hungary, now moving in to the country which they're closest to. And they do literally see this. They watched the mob on the Maidan. What they saw was...
Do you think it was a mob?
Call it what you like. The crowd on the Maidan. I don't care. They watched Tory Newland, the US Secretary of State responsible, going down there, encouraging them, dishing out cookies. They see people coming from the West, Banderostovцы, as they're called, as they're proud to call themselves. They recently ran a demonstration in Lvov in support of the glorious moment when they let Hitler in to Western Ukraine. They see, I'm not saying that this is all that was behind the revolt, but in the Russian eyes, this is a conspiracy to seize and attach to the West the country, as I say, which they have always felt closest to. And this was the moment when Putin decided, after everything that's gone before, that as they saw it, Western approach had to stop. And, well, we've seen what happened subsequently. Ukraine, more or less, Crimea, more or less, falls into their lap. And then they are now, and I don't deny this, systematically pursuing destabilization in eastern Ukraine as well. It's pretty clear what they want. They don't want to occupy Ukraine. They certainly don't want to invade Ukraine. They don't want to be in a situation where there are Ukrainians and Russians shooting each other, which would be very damaging for everyone. But they do want to retain significant influence on Ukraine going forward. They don't want Ukraine to slip into NATO, as everyone else has done. They don't want Ukraine to slip into the EU, as a lot of other people have done. They want to retain their links in a country which they regard as being very much part of their sphere of influence. And this is where we come to the choice, because the West, of course, has responded to this. I have to say I'm a little bit uncertain about what the point of Western policy is. I was talking to a minister this morning, a slightly unhappy minister, and I said, what are you doing all this stuff for? And he had some trouble explaining it to me. But the West is now on a policy of shutting Russia out of the G8, banning high-tech exports to Russia, imposing various sorts of economic sanctions on Russia. And I say, you ask what it's for, you read the texts to see what it's for, and you read President Obama, who says, he doesn't say we're going to change Russian policy, because evidently they aren't. We're going to change Mr. Putin's calculus. You read William Hague's explanation of what we're up to, and he talks about reinforcing Western solidarity. This is all about sort of internal psychological processes rather than actually effectively doing anything about Russian policy. And if you look at the impact so far, early days, the impact of this new Western confrontational policy, sanctions. They've simply strengthened Russian resistance and aversion to our approach in Ukraine. They've strengthened the Russian determination to make sure that their hand is present in Ukraine going forward, whatever it costs. Ukraine for Russia is an existential issue. This isn't about money. This is about their political spread. And sanctions, however deep, are not going to turn Putin or the Russians around on it. Communication. A lot of solving this problem, in my view, is going to be about our talking to the Russians and finding a way through. In my view, what the Russians are looking for is perfectly negotiable. But we are gradually putting on the sanctions lists all of the top people in Russia with whom we might have contemplated doing a deal. Naryshkin, Kozak, Ivanov, one by one, they're being crossed off the list of people we can talk to as we balmily exclude them from sensible dialogue. Somehow, do we dream we're subtracting from Putin's popularity, from the viability of Putin's regime? Putin's popularity has shot up as a result of Western policy. It's gone up from about 60% to about 80%. We are reinforcing the Putin regime in exactly the same way as the US sanctions against Cuba have reinforced Castro's regime for the last 50 years. And what are we doing good for Ukraine? We are actually simply compelling the Russians, because we're not talking to them to do the deal, to maintain their attitude of destabilization, of deconstruction, and therefore making it much more difficult in the long run to give the Ukrainians the democracy, the stability which they want, and actually which we all want for them as well. So as I say, choice between confrontation and engagement. I'm not quite sure what Peter's going to say about all this, but nevertheless, it seems to me that at least as the tests extend so far, confrontation is visibly deficient, is visibly is actually delivering the reverse of the results which it is intended to deliver, and is making it Russia is too big, too rich, too centered in the world. This stuff about isolating them, okay, we may isolate them, although I think that's going to be very hard as well. I see no will at all in the EU to do anything about gas and oil imports. Meanwhile, they're talking, if you look at all of Putin's speeches, there's China, there's India, there's Indonesia. It's a fascinating point about this crisis is that if you look at the big developing countries, they have all sat very firmly on the fence. And this despite the fact that Russia's seizure of Crimea, they will all have hated. They all rather like maintaining borders, maintaining political stability. But even when Putin has done the sort of action which they most loathe, they are averse to criticise him because they dislike the West trying to impose its hegemony much more than they dislike what Putin has done. So as I say, confrontation isn't working, has no visible purpose, and is not going to take us anywhere except deeper into the crisis, which has already got a lot deeper than any of us hoped for. So I hope you will reflect that engagement actually did yield a lot more over the years since 1991, is the place we should be looking to get back to. And let me leave you with this thought. John Kenneth Galbraith once observed that all foreign policy is a choice between the unpalatable and the disastrous. And while talking to Mr. Putin is no doubt unpalatable, I suspect that not talking to him may well be disastrous. Thank you very much.
Before we move on, can I invite anyone at the back who's come in the last few minutes and who doesn't have a seat to come to the front? There are still lots of seats at the front. Please do come forward. There's plenty of room. Now, Roger Boys, you've heard the case for engagement with Putin, put very eloquently by Tony Brenton. How does it look from the chair of the diplomatic editor of the Times?
Well, I must say, I think, Daniel, it was a brilliant move to invite the Russian ambassador to London, Antony Brentonov, here to make the Russian case. He couldn't have done it better. As I understand Tony's position, it has similarities to the German. That's to say, we can change Russian policy through trade, that engagement changes Russian behavior, whereas I thought, frankly, the events of the last 6 years have shown this, at least the last 6 years have shown this to be absolute rubbish. And second, of course, Tony presented a very good case for Russian victimhood, you know, the sense of encirclement, the sense of the harm, the terrible, terrible suffering that they've gone through over these years. And it's really quite heartbreaking stuff. But I don't think, as a matter of principle, that Russian paranoia should be the basic principle of British foreign policy. It's just the false starting point. And the truth is, Putin is playing us. He's playing the British. He's playing Europe. He's trying to split Europe from the United States in a myriad different ways. And if we listen to Tony's arguments, we'd be absolutely nowhere. I came across someone the other day who told me about Fyodor Ushakov, who was the great Russian admiral from the Napoleonic times, or pre-Napoleonic times, who'd built the Sevastopol naval base. And he was a Russian hero, a Soviet hero initially, and then he became a Russian hero. And his medal, a great whopping silver medal, is the highest award for bravery. Now, on April the 11th, Putin had a special meeting in the Kremlin, just as he was mopping up the Crimea, to authorize 3,000 new bravery medals to be minted, partly for the new Russian heroes that are in the background to the present operation, but also for British sailors who are involved in the Arctic convoys, which is, I suppose, something we should welcome. But you should also recognize that Putin is playing, it's like he's playing on 4 honky-tonk pianos at once. And one of them is the sentimentality of the British about Russia, the sense that Russia suffered, that we were allies, that there is some shared loss of blood that binds us with, you know, and makes us open to the Russian soul. In fact, the Russian soul, of course, is a very sort of alcoholic phenomenon, but
we don't have any of that here.
We haven't had enough of that, have we, Peter? I find. So we mustn't be played. We mustn't be played on this sentimentality line, or on the business line that Tony seems very enthusiastic about, or indeed in this feudalization situation, which Ben has so eloquently expressed. I mean, on the business line, there's been now a procession. Shell, BP, all these sort of people, because, of course, it's in Putin's gift to give Arctic exploration, Sakhalin exploration rights to British companies. British companies are nervous. They're going to Moscow. We should be worried about this. We should be worried because something has happened. Something has subverted British foreign policy in a way that's rather unpleasant. Of course, the petrochemical industry is indeed volatile. It's full of risk, but there is too much of this leaning in towards Putin. The most recent example of this extraordinary interweave between Russian interests, Russian commercial interests, Russian consumer interests, and our own humble role as the concierge of the oligarchs was I saw something. I haven't met anybody quite as grand recently as either of you two, but I did meet someone from Zambia who ran or used to work on an alligator farm, which I won't go into the whole details of this, but it did indeed involve alcohol, this meeting. But he used to work on an alligator farm which produced alligator skins or alligator hides that were sent to Morocco to be treated and made into handbags which were commissioned by British shops for Russian oligarchs' wives. That's the kind of interdependency that Tony Brenton is fighting for, and it should make quite a big difference, if nothing else, then at least to the Zambian economy. So feudalization worries me. It worries me, of course, you know, the plastic surgeons, the stockbrokers, the lawyers on their QC, meters, the schools. They're all, but Ben has already completely picked that all out. But it does tell me one thing, that this whole argument is largely about self-respect. It's okay being the servant of an oligarchic class, but not the serf. Yeah? Servants can choose their masters. Serfs can't. And we're entering some kind of situation where we've gone too far. Now, Peter will probably argue, for example, that we've always been like that. You know, I mean, the 1970s, OPEC, the sheikhs, you know, the Kuwaitis coming in. We've done, yes, and now the Chinese.
It's a good point.
Yeah,
Thank you.
done, well, it's all right. But I would argue, it must be said, that there is a category difference between petrodollars coming in from Emiratis in the 1970s and 1980s, and from people who are, in effect, financing and supporting a regime that has just directly challenged our interests by invading a country within Europe. Our interest as a NATO member, our interest as a European Union member, Putin should not be allowed to define the outer frontiers of the European Union, and that's precisely what he's doing. He's denying Ukraine a choice, and that's not the side of the argument that Britain should be on. So it seems to me that we should have thought about this a long time before Ukraine, that something has been rotten in this relationship for a long, long time. And at the very latest, we should have thought about it when Putin ordered one of his critics to be poisoned in the streets of London. That at the very, very latest, the Litvinenko case should have made us reconsider and recast this whole relationship. The whole relationship, which is based on Tony's assumption that somehow we can westernize, modernize, and civilize the Russians through business. It's a flawed argument, and it just won't wash. So the question, and then there's a strategic argument, which is should we be dealing with Putin at all, or should we be thinking about the post-Putin era? Should we be thinking about what comes next? All these people are coming here, all these Russian... I don't like the word oligarch. I think I share that with most people on this thing, because the oligarch suggests that every wealthy person is suspect and every wealthy person has some kind of essential political power. That's not the case. And I don't want to make the case that all rich Russians should leave the country tomorrow. This is not a UKIP situation. But it is... But we do have to think about the post-Putin era. We do have to think about this growing Russian middle class who don't much like Putin either. Okay, you say the Putin popularity rates have gone up to 82% or something. You know, frankly, if there'd been objective opinion polling after the Anschluss, Hitler too would have, his ratings would have gone through the roof. But that's...
They did.
It's not about that. It's about this growing middle class, these cities of 1 million or more in Russia, who are developing different ideas, demanding more from their local governments and from central government, and demanding more, and a little bit afraid of demanding more from Putin. These are the people we should be addressing. I don't want to be anti-Russian. I don't think any of us should be anti-Russian. But we've got to understand that Putin's course is running to a close. The Sochi Olympics were the zenith. Now it's in his kind of twisted dream anyway, and now it's slipping down very fast. You, on your side of the podium, are actually backing a loser, a man who deserves to lose, a man who's completely mismanaged and broken his country's polity. So the point is, why are these people coming? Why are rich people, not just oligarchs, why are rich people coming to wage their cases in British courts? Why are they sending their kids to schools here? Why are they coming to private hospitals here? Because Russian courts are rubbish, because Russian courts are corrupt, because Russian schools are very limited. They have positive points as well, but they're very limited. The kind of things that a Russian with money wants and wants to invest in is not there. He's been denied this possibility. They're coming to London. We do, by telling them not to do that, by making it more complex, by abolishing, by restricting, for example, their visa access. We are saying, stay where you are, invest your money at home, and improve your own civic society, your own structure, your own social structure. We can actually help the Russians in their path into the post-Putin era by doing this. It's an act not only to recover our self-respect, but also to help Russia find a way forward. How much more time do I have?
I'm afraid you've had your time, really,
I've had my
Roger.
time. Okay, well, I'll come back.
We'll have another chance to speak
Okay, cool.
a little later. Thank you very much, Roger. Well, that was from the heart and extremely apposite. But now, finally, we turn to Peter Hitchens, who I notice is wearing a medal. Perhaps you could explain to us, Peter, what that is.
Oh, I
and
shall.
why you're wearing
Shall
it.
permit me to explain everything. I thought I'd put it on because I knew at some stage in this evening I would be accused either explicitly or implicitly of being some kind of shill or patsy for the Soviet, that's what they really think, Russian government. And that I would sort of make a satirical demonstration of my supposed allegiance to this wicked regime. Ladies and gentlemen, there is absolutely nothing Soviet about me except perhaps my dress sense. I loathe the Soviet Union. As Daniel will recall, I was a cold warrior of considerable ferocity. And when I lived for 2.5 years of my life, 2.5 astonishing, exhilarating, and life-changing years of my life in Moscow, that feeling was only intensified, and I still cannot get over my personal delight at seeing with my own eyes two things. One, the defeat of the putsch in Moscow in August 1991, which I witnessed. The tanks came up my street. And the day after it all fell, every single litter bin in Moscow was full of the same thing. Dozens and dozens and dozens of Communist Party membership cards burning. It was the end. It was plainly the end. This was no longer the Soviet Union. Later, I was privileged to go down, be one of the first foreigners to get into the closed city of Sevastopol and see in the creeks and inlets surrounding that beautiful place dozens of Sergei Gorshkov's ships, the remnants of his global navy, sunk down by the stern, down by the bow, listing over, full of water, covered in rust, ruined, deserted, finished. The Soviet attempt to become a world challenger to the United States, to be the second superpower, was over at the same time as the Communist Party and the whole hideous reign of communism over Russia was over. And the reason, you ask why Russians come to London to live, why Russians send their children to school in London, why Russians come to London for medical treatment, I'll tell you exactly why. Because 70 years of communism destroyed everything worth having in Russia, and it's going to take a lot more than that to put it back. And we should have a little bit more sympathy with that. The other reason I'm wearing this medal, it was given to me by a Russian friend, and I feel that it is worth pointing out from time to time that one must separate Russian people from the Russian regime. And if I speak for anybody here, and nobody's paying me to do so, it's the Russian people whom I remember and know and continue to like, and whose point of view I think is not seen here. And here is an interesting thing. I would imagine, because this is a meeting organised by Standpoint, there are quite a few people here who spent some time trying to defend Israel against stupid, ignorant, selective critics. And what they will have found over and over again is that these critics of Israel fix on certain characteristics of that country. And in the end, you have to admit, when defending it, yes, these things are true. Israel has many things that are wrong with it, many, many things that are wrong with it, many things which are virtually indefensible, but they are not unique to Israel. Now take Russia. There are many things wrong with Russia, though quite why we, in a country whose political parties are bought and sold by dodgy millionaires, and a country which has a whole province, Northern Ireland, which we have surrendered to the rule of armed gangsters, quite why we are in a position to lecture Russia about oligarchs and gangsterism, I am not absolutely sure. But if you want to criticize Russia, will you please also turn your minds to those favorite countries of The Economist magazine, such as Turkey, ruled also by an extremely unpleasant man who jails his critics, whose prisons are full of journalists, who holds show trials, whose government and country is fantastically and deeply corrupt. Or then again, Saudi Arabia, to which we are always so anxious to sell those useless aeroplanes which we make for no other purpose than to sell them. Or one could go on. We are not exactly preaching from a position of purity in this matter, and I think we should get over it. And the other problem which we have, and Hitler of course comes up as well, is that many of the people who were possibly behind devising this motion suffer from PMS, Perpetual Munich Syndrome. For them, it is always September 1938. Putin is always Hitler. If it's not Putin, it's Saddam Hussein or somebody else, or General Noriega. He is always Hitler. You, who are arguing with him, are always Neville Chamberlain, and he is always Winston Churchill. Hear him roar. It's always the same. It's a delusion, and it is also historically completely incorrect. The real parallel we need to look at, if we want to look at what's happened to Russia in the past 20 years, is Versailles. And the real historical figure we need to refer to is Woodrow Wilson, who imposed upon Europe a series of completely unsustainable, nay, insane borders which could have conceivably lasted, and which Gustav Stresemann would have got rid of if he'd lived long enough to do so. It's not a Hitlerian point. We have been responsible for some very, very stupid diplomacy, and we have pushed up against the ultimate borders of Russia. I think it was Zbigniew Brzezinski who said of Russia that with Ukraine, Russia is an empire, and without Ukraine, Russia is barely a nation. And the leeching away from Russia of Ukraine, originally in the completely accidental collapse of the Soviet Union, and subsequently in its seduction by NATO and the European Union, has been consciously essayed by people as an attempt to belittle and destroy Russia for reasons which I have to say remain almost wholly baffling for me when I look at the interests of my own country. because this is where I am really puzzled. I'm quite cross about Daniel for drafting the motion in this way, and I would resent it if I were that kind of person. What it places before you a choice between being a principled, great, wonderful, clean, incorruptible person who hates oligarchs and a nasty person who might conceivably stand up for Vladimir Putin. And there is no other choice. But of course, this is absolute cobblers, indeed ocean-going cobblers, because the Ukraine, which we get so emotional about, is crammed from top to bottom and left to right with oligarchs, many of whom are on our side. And if we disliked oligarchs so much, we wouldn't be having anything to do with them. So that falls for a start. Secondly, why is it that we in this country, and again, I would have thought that readers of Standpoint might be just a teensy-weensy bit sceptical about the European Union, why is it that we are so keen about expanding the European Union into areas of Europe where it doesn't, frankly, belong? And this is where I get into my really controversial bit, because I feel that there was no point in coming here if I wasn't a bit controversial, and this is where it comes. The European Union, ladies and gentlemen, is a reverse Clausewitz. It is the continuation of war by other means. There have been 2 occasions in the 20th century in which Ukraine has not been under Russian control. They have both, rather unfortunately, been when it has been under German control. And this is not some childish Fourth Reich Hitlerian point. German foreign policy, long before Hitler, has been extremely interested in expansion economically, diplomatically, and politically into that part of the world. Most of you will, of course, have heard of Friedrich Naumann, the ancestor of today's Free Democrat Party in Germany, who in 1915 wrote a book called Mitteleuropa, which suggested strongly, Daniel, of course, knows all this, which suggested strongly that Germany's interests lay in that part of the world and indeed dominating it. And many people saw the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk of 1918, with which, of course, you'll also be familiar because you're that kind of people, as the actual embodiment of Friedrich Naumann's plan. And had it not been for the unfortunate fact that the German Empire was defeated shortly afterwards in the West, the Peace of Brest-Litovsk would have been sustained, and indeed that part of the world would have come and remained under German domination. The second attempt to do so, of course, we all know about it, took place in 1941. It was called Barbarossa. And it is very interesting to me that the European Union now, which I think nobody can seriously deny is dominated ultimately by Germany, is pushing its way into these areas again. Not in pursuit of a Hitlerian policy, but in pursuit of a nice, liberal, non-militaristic, non-Nazi, free democrat policy, which Germany has had for more than a century, and which is quite reasonable for it to have, quite honestly, and in which it is undoubtedly bound to come into conflict with Russia. A sensible solution to this, as it is in all conflicts between major countries, is compromise. So why is it that rather than seeking compromise, almost our entire media commentariat, almost all our politicians, almost anybody with a voice in this country speaks constantly as if Russia is a loathed and mistrustful enemy which has to be driven out of Central Europe as if it were Hitler, constantly compares Mr. Putin with Hitler, constantly suggests that there is some battle to come, urges, I hear people doing this all the time, the stationing of more troops and more airplanes in the NATO members bordering Russia. What are we playing at? Have we, as Eisenhower asked Anthony Eden during Suez, have we gone quite mad? What is it that we desire? Would any of us here actually go to war or wish any of our sons or daughters to go to war for the Ukraine? Is there anybody here who would do that? And if so, can you explain to me why that would be? There is a real deeper conflict here, and that's also why Standpoint's in this, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, and I will explain it to you. The problem with Russia is that it is not a superpower, but it remains a major sovereign nation. And in the post-Chicago age, the era since Anthony Blair's disgusting little speech in Chicago, which was the curtain raiser for his ludicrous Iraq war and for many other stupid episodes, including the disastrous creation of a failed state in Libya, which we don't examine enough. So ever since the Chicago speech, the view, particularly in the United States, has been that the era of the nation state is over. Let's have supranational bodies. Let's have NATO. Let's have the European Union. Let's forget the era when countries were independent, minded their own business within their own borders, ran their own affairs, and whisper it actually protected their own industries and economies from foreign competition. Let's have an end to that. Let's have a vast mixture of Thatcherism and Deng Xiaoping from Ireland to Vladivostok. with absolutely nothing getting in the way. And here sits in the middle of Europe, this country which refuses to conform, which still stands up because it's big enough to do so, for national sovereignty and for independence of action and for its own borders. If you notice, by the way, the Russian Federation is getting bigger, while the United Kingdom is getting smaller. It could be connected with the fact that they stand up for themselves. I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, and I think before voting for this ludicrous motion, you should consider that for a second.
Very good.
Right. Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you for your generous mention of Standpoint. It's perfectly
I'll
true.
get my check afterwards.
It's perfectly true that we have not been neutral on this subject, but as far as this debate is concerned, I am neutral, and I'm very happy to indulge Peter's extraordinary outburst. But let us continue. Let us continue. Since we have everyone's spoken a little longer than was originally designed, I don't know whether the Frontline Club is going to allow us to stay a little beyond our allotted time of 8:30. But I would like to give the speakers a chance to respond to each other. But I sense that there is a sort of
You've got to let her respond.
there is a tremendous desire among you to have your say as well. So I think I'm going to postpone the comeback from our speakers until we've had a few questions from the floor. So yes, I see already a sea of hands. So what I'm going to do is take about 3 or 4 at a time, and then see who wants to
Isn't it better
respond
to leave
to
our
them.
responses to the questions until our final summing up? Because
Exactly. Sir, yes, would you like to speak?
Well, I just wanted to recap on the basic events what happened in February. So EU foreign ministers brokered a deal for transitional arrangements to fresh elections, and the next day, of course, there was a coup against the man who was the democratically elected president. The fact that it wasn't a very nice man. So, well, I just want I just want the people
Do you have a question?
Yes. Well, my question is my question is those two. So comment on that basic fact about the coup against a democratically elected government.
Okay, Ukrainian coup. This gentleman here. Yep.
Just 2 very quick questions. First, just what impact, if any, do you think this will have on the Syria crisis? As in, no one's mentioned whether or not engaging with Russia is necessary or whether escalating with Russia will help resolve the Syria crisis. And secondly, more one for just Ben. You kind of elided quite neatly high net worth individuals, PEPs, oligarchs, all sorts of slightly dodgy people. Is there any actual evidence you have of anything actually dodgy happening in terms of the UK government policy decisions?
I don't. What the evidence is that.
Hang on. We're going to take a couple more, and then you can come back. Yes, sir.
I'd just like to ask Peter whether he's quite keen to respect Russia's national sovereignty. Why isn't he keen to extend that same courtesy to the Ukraine? And I'd also, sorry, just one other quick question. What, if any, powers do you think the West has in terms of sanctions or anything else to bring Russia to its knees?
Okay, and I think we'll have one final one from this lady here.
Hello, this is a question to Tony. I'm a Russian citizen, half Ukrainian, half Udmurt, which is a Russian minority. And I think it was quite misleading that you kept saying they and Russians. Russians are threatened by the West and by the United States, threatened by the Western Ukraine. I think there has to be a distinction between the government and the Russian people. And the popularity of Kremlin and Putin is driven by the propaganda. And I haven't lived for so many years in Russia. My question is, do you not feel that as a Russian, I never felt threatened by the West or by the United States? I think the biggest threat is actually coming from the Russian government. Wouldn't you agree with that? And then if so, then why support it? If
Okay, that's a good one. Right. Gentlemen, I think we'll stop with that little group of questions, then we'll have some more in a minute. But who'd like to kick off? Ben?
I'd like to kick off, and I'd like to kick off on the fascinating point about Israel. which is, as Standpoint magazine, why are we criticising Russia when we don't criticise Israel? Well, as you may know
this wasn't the point.
as you may know about the Jewish people, we have a very intense bond with our mothers. And I have been called an anti-Semite by my mother for a certain op-ed I wrote in the FT on placing sanctions on settler leaders. Now, coming back to propaganda, and I want to pick up on this, but I actually really enjoyed both your speeches, and they gave a perfect image of what Russian men your age think, what Russian men of your generation who feel the humiliation, the great emasculation of that moment. And I'd like to speak about Russians my age, from the new generation, which, because Russian male life expectancy is 59, are very soon coming up. Let's begin
In that case,
with
I'm dead.
let's begin with TV. When did you last watch Russian TV? I'd like to give you one example of a show by Dmitry Kiselyov, who gives a weekly show on Russian state TV, which is an attempt to brainwash the population. I'm going to cite one example where Mr. Kiselyov said, "Hello, welcome to the news broadcast. We're reporting live, I'm giving live commentary on how the international homosexual plot led by known homosexual agent Carl Bildt and known homosexual agent Westerwelle is attempting to impose homosexuality on Western Ukraine. And here are some strange farting gloves we found on Swedish TV. Look at the repulsive sexualization of children that we see in Sweden." I know you don't watch Russian TV, but this
what has
is
this got to do
wrong.
with it? What has
this
this
is
got to
on Russian TV. This is the kind of propaganda.
Ben, you're wrong. I do.
But then you've seen Kiselyov, and
Yeah.
you know the propaganda that's being pumped in. And what you have done is given a very eloquent narrative that's not the narrative being sold to the Russian population. The narrative being sold to the Russian population is one of hysteria. It says a third of the shops of Kiev are smashed up and are burnt. It says that 500,000 people have fled the country. It says that the Jews are being shot at on the streets of Maidan. And frankly, I think I would
I'm sorry.
know
I need
if
to.
Jews are
I
being
need to
shot
say
at
something at
Maidan.
this point.
Okay,
I do need. No, I need to say something at this point before we get back to the questions, which is we have now had. This has been a very interesting debate, but we've now had from both of our opponents slander by association. You make the Russian view. You're the Russian ambassador in London. I was British ambassador in Moscow through the most difficult time that any British ambassador in Moscow has had up until now. I know and said at the beginning of my statement all the demerits of the Russian system. I am very conscious of them. I have them carved in my skin. So to find myself accused of being pro-Russian because I'm a gull, your word, wasn't it? Gull, being taken for a patsy by Putin. It seems to me that sort of slander is quite unnecessary. I am happy to take your views on their merits. I would hope that you would do the same with
Russian
mine.
state television is telling the population that a genocide that is not taking place is taking place. Russian state television is lying to the population, whipping it up into a state of hysteria and fear, throwing chemical wounding agents on all of the national scars, and you're not mentioning that.
Okay.
Well, we can rely on you to mention that because you will. I mean, there are plenty of things that are wrong with Western broadcasting on this matter. For instance, who in this room even knows that the Russians wanted the representatives of the Eastern Ukrainian, what one might call secessionists, to be invited to the Geneva talks? For the simple reason that they would then have somebody at the Geneva talks who would be responsible for the agreement. And the Ukrainians, the European Union, and the United States refused to have them there. You don't know it because it's never been reported. How many of you actually read the Geneva Agreement? It's not been reported. There are huge numbers of things which are not reported in the Western media about what has taken place in Ukraine. It's been extraordinarily badly reported again and again and again. We have very little reason to have pride in our own media's reporting this business. The point that Ben has entirely missed about Israel is this: selective criticism, where you criticize a country for bad things, which you apply only to one country, is always a fake. Your outrage is either genuine, in which case it applies to all those who do this thing, or it is a propaganda fake. It's a propaganda fake against Israel, and on this occasion it's a propaganda fake against Russia. Now, anybody who can have so many dealings with the People's Republic of China, a titanically corrupt police state, and consider themselves to have clean hands, it seems to me to be beyond belief. We are not making a moral case here. We're actually arguing from simple practical politics. My arguments about sovereignty in Ukraine, very simple. Ukraine is welcome to be sovereign, but if Ukraine wants to make itself a tool and province of the European Union and NATO in trying to expand into Russian territory and diminish the ability of Russia to defend itself, I think you have to wonder about whether that is a sovereign country that you're dealing with. And there is one other point I would make to everybody in this room. Most of us have grown up entirely surrounded by water. And Americans have two oceans on one side, Mexico underneath and Canada on top. They have absolutely no conception, as we have not, of what it is like to live in a country with borders, with other countries which may be hostile to you. Russia is ceaselessly invaded. It's been invaded again and again by Tatars, Finns, Lithuanians, Poles, Germans. And it is used to being invaded, and it takes steps to try to avoid it. And it's not reasonable to describe these attitudes as paranoia. And are you a qualified psychiatrist anyway? It is perfectly reasonable for a country with land borders to look after its own interests. And it really is time that we smug islanders, who only remain free because of that water, not because of anything we did, we smug islanders got used to the fact that other people have different problems from us.
I just want to see if Roger wants to come back to any of these questions, or indeed any of
From
the
the floor,
points.
perhaps. But I
From the
mean,
floor.
I think amongst a list of 10 extraordinary statements, I think I listed here, from Peter, the one that really struck me was the admiration that Russia is getting bigger. But we sort of know how Russia is getting bigger, don't we? I mean, haven't they just snatched a piece of a sovereign country? Whatever historical claim they may say they've got on it, are they not subverting and coercing within Ukraine?
You're against
to
that
destabilize it?
on principle, are you?
On subverting and coercing and trying to...
You're against countries in their own interests when they feel threatened and when they think they've got a population in an area. You're against them using military force to seize territory under those. So that's a principle with you, is it?
I see where you're leading.
What am I coming to?
You're trying to come into the South Atlantic.
No, I'm not
but
actually.
It's not.
I'm coming to a NATO member whose alliance you're perfectly happy with, who I've never seen you or your newspaper criticise for this, which is Turkey, which is still in occupation of northern Cyprus. What is it now? 40 years of illegal occupation in northern Cyprus.
Peter,
Nobody gives a damn because they're our friends. It's complete hogwash.
This whataboutism is cheap.
This
is really cheap.
It's quite expensive.
It's just going
low-level argumentative
It just goes
tactics.
nowhere.
Can I just ask, because
Can I address a couple of the
we did have a
questions?
couple of questions from the floor.
Yes, let's do
Has
that.
anyone on
Yes,
this...
I'm happy.
Okay.
I'm happy to take a
Tony,
couple of the
you-
questions because I thought they were really interesting questions.
Me too. I think we do have to address the coup
Yeah,
question.
there was a question about, is this going to be helpful on Syria? And the obvious answer to that is no. And the answer goes wider than that. If we pursue our current punitive policy with regard to Russia, then not only does Syria become harder, but Iran becomes harder, climate change becomes harder, a whole string of bits of international governance become harder. And that is a so far only slowly developing cost of the punitive approach to Russia, which our opponents there advocate. The other, the really interesting question I thought was from Ukrainian Udmurti, girl there in the... I'm not allowed to call you girls anymore, lady. And I think, you're right, obviously, that there is a distinction between the regime view of the Russian threat and the Russian people's view of the Russian threat. Just as there was I started my career in the Foreign Office in the Cold War, and there was a very evident distinction between the way we diplomats and soldiers and all of them saw Russia as a threat, and the vast majority of the British people didn't really take that threat so seriously. So I accept that no doubt the regime sees the Russian threat much more. When I talk about Russia with regard to being worried about the Western threat, that's principally the regime, but I would claim not only, actually. I agree there's propaganda, there's all sorts of misleading stuff going on in Russia, as there always has been. But I'm a Democrat. I, on the whole, believe in the good sense of people, and I believe in the determination of people on the whole to keep themselves reasonably well informed. And in Russia, they mistrust, of course, official sources of information. Nevertheless, the very sharp rise in Putin's popularity in response to what's been going on in Ukraine seems to me, does contain a substantial component of concern among the Russian people, not necessarily the Moscow middle class, but the Russian people in general, about what we're up to. And sorry, if I can add one other point to that, if I can remember it now. Yes, very good point raised, I think, by Roger, that a bit of what this has to be about is about helping the Russian people. Indeed it does. And then some stuff about we help the Russian people into a post-Putinian world, which is, of course, nonsense. We're not going to change the internal dynamics of Russian politics. What we can do is stand firmly critical of their appalling human rights records, lack of rule of law, all that sort of stuff. No question about that. But we actually make it harder if we enable Putin to stand up and look like a patriot. Yes. Much better, if we want to help the Russian people, is actually to get out of this Ukraine quagmire and get on with the more important business of trading with them, relating to them, and helping them advance their own political and economic processes.
Right, I think we're going to take one more round of questions from the floor, and I'm sorry there are too many of you for me to ask you all, but please bear with me. Yes, the lady in the middle there. Yes. Have we got a mic? Well, sorry, there are two. Yeah. Thank you.
Have we got an extension?
Yeah, we've got a little more time. Yeah.
I actually come from Kiev, so I feel particularly emotional about everything that we're discussing here.
Would you mind just telling us whether you feel more Ukrainian or more Russian or both?
Well, ethnically, I'm 100% Ukrainian, so I don't know if that explains anything, but I mean, it's what I would like to comment about. I've noticed that what was mentioned here in the panel as well, that British people feel very sentimental about Russia. Like there were phrases said, you know, we spilled our blood, they spilled our blood in the Second World War. I would like to remind you that actually, you know, the huge human burden during the Second World War was taken by Ukraine. And in fact, that was the deadliest place in Europe between 1933 and 1945. Secondly, that I think British people feel kind of a bit sentimental, a little bit maybe guilty about, you know, demise of the Soviet Union, that Russia went through hardship and poverty and, you know, feeling of humiliation and so on. But so did Ukraine. So I just would like to say that we experienced exactly the same processes as Russia, you know, and the fate of 44 million people country, you know, sometimes it's being completely overlooked in this debate. So my question is, you know, there was also, one of you said that traditionally Ukraine is a sphere of influence of Russia and we shouldn't really meddle into this. It's true, but then could you imagine that United Kingdom could behave in a similar way to the countries which once constituted part of the British Empire, you know, in exactly the same way Russia is now doing, you know, to Ukraine? Thank you.
Okay. This gentleman here in the front.
A large part of Britain's engagement with Russia, its economic engagement with Russia, is facilitating illicit financial flows. Russia is the largest victim in the world, according to Global Financial Integrity, of illicit financial flows, about $190 billion a year. Is our continued involvement in this engagement aiding Russia's social, economic and political development, or is it undermining it?
Okay, that's a good question. Now, over on this side, yes, the gentleman at the back there, please. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much to the panel. I'm a former member of the European Union Border Assistance Mission to Moldova and Ukraine, and my question is based on a subsequent visit last month, April, to Ukraine, where I was invited to meet a senior member of the interim administration who said, and it was as much said by eye contact as by words, we need help and we need deep and profound assistance, because they genuinely felt that certain aspects of the country were such that the sovereignty of their entire country was at stake. And I'm not referring to Eastern Ukraine. My question, and I will be taking it up with a former colleague of Sir Anthony Brenton in the next few weeks. We've arranged a meeting. Okay. My question is, following on from the previous gentleman's point, is enough being done to link not just the illicit financial flows, but with activities that would be illegal in other terms. Because I believe the current Russian government and indeed associates in Ukraine past and maybe Ukraine present and other ex-Soviet countries are potentially very vulnerable. Have we really got our act together in taking a holistic look at embarrassing these organizations and not just getting the money, but embarrassing them? There's real opportunities being missed.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, this gentleman here, right? Yep, thanks.
Mr. Hitchens talked about the evils of the Soviet Union. Isn't it completely understandable for those countries that were under the domination of the Soviet Union to seek the protection of NATO in trying to protect their sovereignty?
Fair enough. And this lady at the front as well, please.
I wanted to ask, will Russia stop with Ukraine? Or if it's allowed, will it continue further? And what is, if the panel could explain what the strategic importance of that part of Ukraine is, please?
Thank you. And finally, this gentleman here, who's been very patient.
I'm honored. Thank you. Looking forward, 2 or 3 years out, the IMF bailout's forthcoming, I understand, and there are elections this month. Maybe I'm wrong, in Kyiv. Yeah. Where do you see Ukraine in 3 or 4 years?
Right. Thank you. Okay, that'll have to do just for now. So I'm just going to go swiftly from right to left. Peter, do you want to pick up any of those points?
Because the Soviet Union no longer exists, I don't really see why we should need to protect anybody from it. The Soviet Union was a different thing from Russia. It had different ambitions, it had a different nature. And in fact, I remember Russians of my acquaintance being deeply upset and puzzled by the way in which they were being treated by the United States in the Gorbachev era on this matter. And I believe that Russian diplomats have repeatedly, and indeed Vladimir Putin has many years ago, urged the Western countries to stop this constant extension of NATO up to Russia's borders. My own view is that if you think Vladimir Putin is bad, you should wait and see what you get if things go wrong for him. And that one of the things which would create something worse than Vladimir Putin is this folly of teasing a large and, how shall I say, insecure country in this fashion. I don't think that the Baltic republics are in any way safer as a result of NATO membership than they were without it. I think in many ways they're more endangered. The point about the sentimentality of the past, I don't know where this comes from. My father was actually one of those who went on the convoys to Murmansk. I'm still trying to get, I could get tomorrow if I wanted a medal for him from the Soviet authorities or Russian authorities. I've never applied for one. The one which he's due from the Royal Navy, though he's been dead now since 1987, is still not available. But he was not sentimental about the Russians or the Soviet Union, and nor am I. I just feel that we should treat them as a civilized people, if not as a lovely regime. We should treat them as a civilized people and treat them with a certain amount of respect if we don't expect to make trouble. The question, who's next, I think completely misunderstands this move. This is a defensive move against a very strong diplomatic aggression. I would repeat again, the European Union is the continuation of war by other means. The European Union has always expanded, the most astonishing diplomatic development probably in human history, the abolition of every border from the Pas-de-Calais to Brest-Litovsk, all gone. The total abolition of the Treaty of Versailles at a stroke in the Schengen Agreement. The effective takeover of Europe through customs union, economic power, currency union, and centralization and bureaucracy. It is the most astonishing thing, and it doesn't advance with armies and tanks. It advances by the methods we saw. And of course everybody knows that the GRU are active in Eastern Ukraine. Of course they are. Who doubts it for a moment? But do you not think that anybody else is active in Western Ukraine? Why do you think, although it wasn't reported in many British papers, let alone on the television, why do you think the director of the CIA was in Kiev 2 weeks ago, if you even knew it had happened? What do you think the European Union and the United States have been doing? Would you tolerate the presence, for instance, in Edinburgh, of American and European Union politicians urging people to vote for Scottish independence? What would you think about it? You'd think it was mighty peculiar. That's what's been happening. There has been a huge political aggression, and Russia is responding to aggression. It's not making it.
And not a word about corruption. Not a word about the corruption.
I'm against
that's
it,
going
okay?
on. Not a word about the corruption that's going on in
I'm
Russia.
against corruption.
Let's-
I'm against corruption in the Middle East. I'm against corruption here. I'm against corruption in Russia. I'm against corruption in China.
What
I'm against
Russia
corruption
is
in the
being-
United States.
Russia that you
I'm against
claim to
nepotism
love-
in all
The
kinds
Russia
of
that you
places.
claim-
I'm just against it, okay?
The Russia that you claim to love is being pillaged. And let me
people-
give
the
you an
people.
example
Yeah, I
of
know
what
it-
is happening.
I know it is.
Let me give you an
I
example.
thought
of what
we
is-
were going to go from
let
right
me,
to left.
I'm responding to it. Let me give you an example of what's happening.
I think Tony's got a point, Ben. It'll be your turn in a moment. Tony.
Okay,
Tony,
three. If I could just address three.
If you could pick up one or
three
two of
the
the
questions. Yes.
Yeah.
Are the financial outflows helpful to Russia? Someone there asked, and the answer is no. Of course, as Ben said, Russia is being pillaged. There's lots of money flowing out, and indeed Putin has spoken up against it and tried to discourage it. It's quite striking fact about Russia, which we think of as an uncontrolled autocracy, but actually Putin has not been able to change the rules to control these outflows. And the point I would make about them, I got Ben's point about how a lot of it's illegal. I actually got to know the city authorities quite well when I was ambassador, and I know that they come down very heavily on illegal money when they find it. Now, it may be that our rules...
0.26% of cases.
It may be that our rules are too lax, but this wouldn't just be about Russia. This would be about Nigerian money, Arab money, Chinese money, and they may be hesitant to make the rules tougher. But this is not a Russia issue. This is a city. This is how the UK makes its living issue. Second question, will Russia stop with Ukraine? It's a very good question, because there's been an awful lot of stuff in the more excitable bits of the press about this is a new revanchist Russia that we are now dealing with. And there's a grain of truth in that. The Putin whom I knew and I dealt with when I was ambassador was an extremely risk-averse man. And what he did in Ukraine, in Crimea, was undoubtedly taking a risk which I would not, and actually not only me, but the British Foreign Office, the State Department, no one imagined he would take. So we are dealing with a different Russia than we thought we were dealing with. But that said, and that's probably one of the big changes as a result of this crisis, but that said, Ukraine, as I tried to explain, is very, very special in Russian eyes. For them, what they have done is not an act of revanchism, it's not an act of offence, it's an act of defence against a Western attack. They are not facing Western attack in any of the other obviously vulnerable places, Moldova, Lithuania, Latvia,
Georgia?
Estonia. Georgia we can have an interesting discussion about, because of course the Georgians took the suicidal step of invading Russia back in 2008. Partially,
Well, Russia.
there was a big.
It's not technically Russia now.
The EU was so embarrassed by its reaction to what happened, the obscure things that happened at the beginning of the Georgian war, that they sent a nice lady called Heidi Tagliavini with a vast number of experts out to actually investigate it. And her conclusion, in a vast report, but with a tolerably short summary, is that the Georgians started the war. And the Russians then had no choice but to come back to them. So, will Russia stop with Ukraine? My instinctive answer is yes. Ukraine is sufficiently special. In their point of view, it's an act of defence rather than offence. Can't guarantee it. We're dealing with a slightly different Putin, but that's my guess. Third, really interesting question. Where will Ukraine be in 3 or 4 years' time? Very good question. And my answer to that, and I've been wrong at every single major stage of this crisis, I should warn you, is that if we do a deal, then Ukraine could be well on the route to becoming a normal, democratic, prosperous place, and an example to Russia itself, which I think is something we're going to lose out of this. If we don't do a deal, then the current situation is going to slide downhill. We're going to lose Russia in our attempt to save Ukraine. We're going to save neither of them. Ukraine will probably split, and we will all be much worse off.
Right.
Neither of these men want to engage seriously with the issue of corruption and the British elite's culpability in the pillage of Russia. In Russia currently, you have one of the biggest acts of pillage in modern history, and you have rough estimates of roughly a third of each budget being siphoned off out of the country and placed in mostly British tax havens. This can be very abstract, so I'd like to give you an illustration that's just come out of Ukraine, which under Yanukovych worked on precisely the same model. Ukraine has a 2% HIV/AIDS infection rate, one of the highest in Europe, and that's on the edge of a pandemic. You have in Ukraine a terrible situation where 50% of people don't receive any retrovirals. So these people are dying when they don't have to, in extreme pain at a very young age, mostly. What's happened? Where's the money gone? The money, several friends of Yanukovych were the only people allowed to produce and sell retrovirals, stole all the money, and where did the money go? Money went to British tax havens, and that makes me ashamed to be British. What I'm talking about in terms of how we need to combat the spread of Putinism, I wasn't talking about Ukraine, I wasn't talking about tanks and borders and planes and flags. I was talking about stopping what I was under the impression was one of your favourite themes, Mr. Hitchens, was the moral degeneration of Britain and a situation where British industrial leaders and banking and financial titans are prepared to accept stolen money that results in the deaths of other human beings because it's no longer placed there. This is a disgraceful situation. In why this crisis has happened is that Vladimir Putin's popularity over the past 5 years has been collapsing. It's been collapsing because Russians don't have roads. It's been collapsing because Russians don't have hospitals. It's been collapsing because Russians don't have a functioning state because their money and their future is stolen and kindly and happily placed in Mayfair with British allies and friends, making sure that's possible.
Okay. Did you want to pick up any of the points from the floor, or I mean, that was very...
The reason that this war has happened is because Putin wanted a short, victorious war to restore his popularity, and tragically it appears to be working. And by only debating sentiment, only debating emotion, only debating nostalgia, you're falling for Putin, the master of nostalgia, and you're not recognising the long-term train wreck of the Russian state when you could be helping by imposing tougher anti-corruption standards at home.
Right. I just want to set. I know you want to wind up, but I just want to set one thing straight: that there is no European Union plan to swallow up Ukraine. That's just an absolute absurd fantasy. What had happened was the Ukraine considered that it had a choice between a rather mangled version of a Eurasian Union with Russia and an association agreement with the European Union. It turned out that it didn't really have a choice. The political class, with Yanukovych at the helm, wasn't prepared to give them that choice, nor was Russia. There was no German, a la Peter, there was no German plot to take over Ukraine. In fact, I think if you talk to European Union politicians 6 months ago, they would have fallen off their chairs rather than admit that they wanted Ukraine at any time within the European Union. There's enough problems with bringing Turkey into the European fold without the Ukraine too. You can see how the national debate is in Britain. Well, there's a similar debate in Germany. There's a similar debate in France. Nobody actually wanted Ukraine. There was no evil plot, and it was certainly not a German-led plot to swallow up Ukraine. Ukraine was always doomed for some kind of limbo. This doesn't speak well for us, but it certainly doesn't justify Putin's actions, which was to consolidate, to some kind of act of imperial consolidation. And that's what we have to prevent.
Well, now, we haven't quite come to the end of our evening. I think we're allowed just a few minutes longer. Is that right? Thank you. So what I just wanted to ask, I notice in the audience one of our other distinguished contributors, Rachel Polonsky, who's contributed a marvellous piece about the leader of the Pussy Riot group, Nadia Tolonovskaya. And I wondered whether she had any comment to make or question to ask just before we have a sort of winding up. Rachel.
Well, this is very impromptu, and I haven't got anything prepared. So if somebody's asking a question. Can I take a minute to think?
Right, sorry. Yes, and I was about to say, Masha, I saw you there as well. Masha Gessen, who's also contributed to sorry, not Gessen, I beg your pardon. That's another Masha. I beg your pardon. Yes.
I've just been thinking of asking Sir Tony Brenton a question when he answered it himself. The question was about the value of engagement. You told us how wonderfully well the engagement with Russia worked, and in the end, you said we're dealing with a different Russia now, and this different Russia is definitely more dangerous than the one there was. If the West had confronted Russia on Chechnya, and you did not tell the truth when you said that it did, because when Putin gassed hundreds of people in Dubrovka theater, both Blair and Bush congratulated him on his wonderful hostage crisis solution. The West did not confront Russia on Georgia, and now it's very feeble in its attempt to confront Russia on Ukraine. And don't you think that if confrontation was started then, when Russia was doing this awful, brutal suppression of Chechnya, Russia would have behaved differently? And a very small point to Peter. Peter Hitchens, I'm sorry. Peter Hitchens seems to think that Russia is a nation state. You mentioned several times that, it has its national sovereignty. In Russia, there are about 50 nations. Russian Federation is an empire, as it used to be. And when you are saying that Britain is surrounded by water, Britain has given up its empire. So you were talking on the part of the Russian people, you said, against Putin. Because I come from Russia, I dare to disagree with you.
Okay. Well, you'll have a chance to come back in a second. Rachel, have you had a chance to collect your thoughts?
Can I just ask a question of Tony Brenton? Are you opposed to any sanctions against Russia in response to Crimean situation? Do you think we should not impose any sanctions? Do you think we should?
Do you want me to take that now?
Well, I think what we're going to do is just have a sort of winding up summary, just a couple of minutes for each of you to respond either to those two questions, both very good questions, or just to summarize your case. And this time I'm going to start with Roger and work across to Peter.
Well, I think Masha is absolutely right that Peter, through his early childhood formation with the Soviet Union, is in a muddle, a category muddle, that Russia is not the same as the federation that surrounds it. And therefore the encirclement of Russia is something largely imaginary. It's felt and is, of course, an element of general staff college training. It's, of course, an element in the political debate within Russia. But, of course, there is no encirclement. There is no threat to Russia. It's part of an architecture of deceit that keeps this regime going. And I don't like it when European Union is somehow portrayed as an aggressor in this whole situation, which is absolutely bonkers. It's quite clear that the European Union is almost helpless in this situation, and the whole gist of our argument jointly has been that we should man up, and the first thing that has to be done is to actually enforce the laws that we have to prevent illegal money flows and illegality.
Thank you very much, Roger. Now's your chance, Ben.
Your last chance.
Our argument has been that London is operating as a Russian and a Ukrainian laundromat. This extends, and my outrage extends to all the other countries that are being plundered, and the British elite are washing their their money here. And I think that the most meaningful thing we can do, and I think we're really committed to Russia's long-term future as a state, we need to prevent money stolen from Russian budgets, Russia ending up here. So I've got a few policy recommendations for everyone.
Not too many, Ben.
The first one,
It's late in the evening.
the first, well, I used to work in a think tank, so I can't quite shake the habit. The first policy recommendation I have is you need on all Ukrainians currently buying in the super high prime luxury London market, you need emergency checks on cash buyers, and that cash buyers need to go through stringent checks to make sure the money isn't money laundered. Because I've been checking in estate agents in Kensington, and they were boasting that guys were coming in with suitcases of money. So emergency checks on Ukrainian cash buyers. That's the first approach to deal with corruption. Second approach is, there's actually no regulator on PR, on public schools, on luxury goods to see if people are handling money that's been stolen abroad. I think that's outrageous. And that property only became under a regulator a matter of weeks ago. And I think this is a shocking situation. The regulator needs to be expanded. Finally, we need to change the law, because British law means that you can't currently investigate a case of corruption and money stolen from state budget in Russia or Ukraine or Nigeria or elsewhere unless that government requests you do so. So if you are a citizen of a state that's suffering state capture from a group of criminals, and this can be anywhere in the world, there's no way the British courts can initiate action. So what we need to do is we need to learn from the French, which allow the law enforcement to work autonomously. And in France, if French law enforcement suspects a case of grand corruption, they can automatically act on that. I think those policies are ones that the Conservatives could push through. I don't see any reason that couldn't be adopted. And I hope that the next government can move towards the far bigger issue, which is that we shouldn't have in British tax havens $7.16 trillion of what is untaxed and mostly laundered money, pillaged from developing countries in the world. Because there's no point having an aid budget if most of the illicit flows out of Africa, the Middle East and Russia is going into our tax havens. And I think if you're proud to be British, you should be proud about fighting crime.
Tony, would you like to respond to Rachel's?
Yes. Well, let me take these points in order, because I think
and Masha as
Masha
well.
came before
Yeah. Yep.
Rachel, and if I got Masha's point right, it is that engagement, which I've been advocating, didn't work brilliantly. Which is a fair point, of course. Our relationship with Putin has gone steadily downhill since he became president in 1999, the end of 1999. It's quite striking looking back on those days. First thing he did was write a letter off to NATO saying, "Can I please join?" It is very interesting the way he has soured on the West. I'm not a sentimentalist about Russia, but I do think the blame lies on both sides with regard to that. I accept that engagement hasn't worked. Certainly at the governmental level, I would claim, firstly, that it's worked much better at the social level. That many more Russians come here, many more Russians put their money here, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Many more Russians are educated here, the inflow and outflow, and certainly in terms of decently audited firms, in terms of Russian links into the wider world, that has been effective. And to repeat, that has produced a fast-growing Russian middle class, largely westernized middle class, which didn't quite overthrow Putin in 2011, 2012, but got reasonably close. And we can live in the hope that if we continue those processes, then finally that's the best thing we can do to dispose of Putin. But that's not a process of condemning him and vilifying him and sanctioning him. That's a matter of developing the social links, which will eventually undermine him from below. On Rachel's point, obviously, with regard to the seizure of Crimea, was a pretty close to unprecedented breach of all the rules of the way we've conducted ourselves in Europe since the Second World War in many ways. And obviously we could not let that pass unchallenged. But sanctions are a pretty crude instrument. They tend to, once you've imposed them, they tend to last an embarrassingly long time. The most conspicuous example, which I've already mentioned, is the US embargo on Cuba, imposed in 1962, which is still there and has done nothing but reinforce the Castro regime. We actually still have an arms embargo on China, imposed at the time of the Tiananmen Square repression in whenever that was, 1989. You need to be very careful about introducing these measures which are resented, which damage links, and which make solving the problems and much harder, actually, in the long term. So yes, you have to do some symbolic stuff. Kick him out of the G8. The G8 doesn't matter anymore anyway. Stop selling them high-tech goods because they're not buying them anyway. Do things which look tough. I'm a diplomat. This is what you do all the time. Do things which look good, but communicate a message, but don't actually fundamentally damage a relationship which remains very important. Can I just make quickly two other points? I'm not going to get into an argument with Ben about money laundering. He obviously feels very strongly about it. I suspect he has a lot of his cases is good. Although I hear all of these assertions about 7 trillion laundered dollars, and I just wonder where the evidence for that is. There's lots of money out there. 17, sorry. There's lots of money out there which isn't dirty. And distinguishing between the two is non-trivial. And as I say, this is not a purely Russian issue. It's not actually a purely City of London issue. It's a global issue about how we manage globalization, actually. But I'm with Ben on the need for enforcing the rules we've got and toughening them where there's an evident case for doing that. But sort of what comes, and I won't accuse Ben of this, but what sort of comes with the way he spoke of it is some hostility to doing business with Russia at all. I think Roger mentioned BP and Shell being in bed with Putin and all that. We need to remember that we depend upon these countries to give us employment and prosperity. Before you go out and start closing down these links with Russia, which of course would simply mean that they'd be replaced by ELF and ENI, before you go out and start closing them down with Russia, and therefore logically, if you're morally consistent individual, with China, with Saudi Arabia, with Nigeria, before we start shutting all the borders on our big companies because they're dealing with bad people, your jobs and mine depend on it. You cannot, it's a big, bad, dirty world out there, and to some extent, you need to be ready to get your hands dirty if you're going to make any sort of living at all in it. My final point is about Ukraine, and I think it's a very good point that's been made. I don't agree with it, but a very good point that really, these thoughts of neutralizing Ukraine and all that, it's for the Ukrainians to choose their own fate. This is obviously right, and if they do get to choose their own fate, they will want to move west rather than east. That's obviously right. The counter-argument to that is that in a world where big powers still behave like big powers, and why we have a sort of European illusion that they don't anymore around here, they certainly do, you have to take account of that reality in making your international dispositions. I would love it for the Ukrainians to be able to make their own choice, but if them making their own choice carries, as I say, the distraction of our relationship with Russia, the setting back of prospects for reform in Russia by 30 years, then maybe that's a price too high. Maybe one way or another, as a price for the money we give them, what have you, you persuade the Ukrainians for their interests and for ours to accept that they're not going to get into NATO for a couple of decades, to accept that they're not going to get into the EU for a couple of decades, as part of the price of rebuilding the prosperous continent we all want to see.
Thank you, Tony. And finally, Peter.
Thank you. If you ever try to, and I do recommend this as an exercise, and if you ever do try to break with conventional wisdom, which is always a good thing to do because conventional wisdom is almost invariably wrong, you will be called names, as I have been this evening, and various accusations will be made about your mental health, as has been made me this evening, and all kinds of things of that kind will happen. And when it happens, you have to take these things as compliments because it really is the only thing to do. I don't think you said get on with it to anybody else, and they've all gone on for quite some time. But if you like, I'll stop now. If you like, I'll stop now. Okay, if you prefer me not to speak, but this is how I choose to address it, if you wouldn't mind. And if you don't like it, then either you can leave or I can. Which is it to be? Okay, thank you. Now, what I was pointing out was that I had been introduced, and I don't propose to respond in kind. Indeed, I look forward to the day when I meet both of these gentlemen in the Café Barnsley in Gorlovka, and we can have a Russian beer together there, and maybe they know where it is. I certainly do. But the point is that we have here a complete misrepresentation of the history of the past 20 years. During the Yeltsin period, which was an era of total debauchery and corruption, during which I have to say that a war was conducted in Chechnya at least as brutal and savage as anything which Vladimir Putin has conducted. Nobody in the West was in the slightest bit bothered about anything that was supposedly wrong with Russia. Nobody cared at all. And yet, all the things which Yeltsin did are being done by Putin, though there is one significant difference, and that is this. Yeltsin permitted far, far, far more carpet-bagging and foreign debauchery in Moscow, and he paid no attention to the Western attempts, which Roger Boys describes as, in such words as plot, the Western attempts to move up to Russia's borders, and as a result, that was fine. The real problem with Vladimir Putin is that he has, to some extent, restrained that debauchery, and the main part of it which is restrained is the way in which foreigners were able to carpetbag. There is a Russian element. I don't claim to speak for the Russian people, but I will quote to you a man called Stanislav Gavoryukin, who made an absolutely superb film about the horrors of Soviet life, which has never been shown in this
Putin's
country.
campaign manager his last election.
Which has never been shown in this country, to the shame of its broadcasting organizations. Stanislav Gavoryukin said, during Putin's last election, he said that what we are now doing is we are returning from the awful ghastliness of the Yeltsin era to normal corruption for Russia. And this is a statement of truth. Anybody who knows Russia or has lived there or who has any experience of it will know exactly what he meant. But the interesting thing is, why is it that Boris Yeltsin was allowed to shell his own parliament with tanks, was allowed to do horrible things in Chechnya, was allowed to be olympically corrupt, and nobody cared, whereas Vladimir Putin is everybody's enemy? I think you need to ask yourself why this is. As to Roger's curious statement that the European Union has no ambitions in the Ukraine, it conflicts rather with what he said earlier. I took a shorthand note of it. Putin should not be allowed to define the outer frontiers of the EU. Now, what he means by that, if he doesn't mean that the outer frontiers of the EU should be extended into Ukraine, I really don't know. And quite honestly, what an association agreement between Ukraine and the EU would mean if it were not the first step towards EU membership, I'm also baffled to descry. So will we please get ourselves straight in this? There is a major political, economic and diplomatic move eastwards being made by the EU, or why else was Baroness Ashton standing amid what we're not allowed to describe as the mob in Kiev? Why do all these things happen? Why was the association agreement contemplated in the first place? Has the EU got any money to spend on Ukraine? I thought Cyprus was bankrupt. I thought Greece was bankrupt. I thought Spain was bankrupt. How is it the EU has money to spend on rescuing the Ukraine, a bottomless pit of bankruptcy, corruption and oligarchy, which somehow or other no one ever mentions when it involves the supporters of the current illegitimate regime? Where is this money to come from? Why is it being offered? Why is it being spent if it isn't for political reasons? They haven't got it to spend. There is something very important going on here. Otto von Bismarck once said, never believe anything till it's been officially denied. And the more respectable way of putting that is that the task of all historians is to penetrate the disguises in which history advances itself. Please don't allow yourself to be bamboozled by propaganda and conventional wisdom. Consider this motion carefully. Remember that you've probably, for the past several months, most of the time heard only one side of a very complicated, very two-sided argument. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Right, it's decision time. It's 9 o'clock, and we're going to have a second show of hands. This time, if it's close, we're going to have to count you. But let's see anyway. I will remind you what the motion is. I'm sorry, Peter, if you didn't like it. This House believes that Britain is more interested in doing business with Russian oligarchs than standing up to Vladimir Putin. Will all those in favour please raise your hands? Right. And all those opposed?
Would you like me to count?
I think the motion has been carried, but it's interesting there are slightly more votes against now than there were at the beginning.
Did you
think? I think perhaps you made
I didn't think there were, actually.
I just want to thank the other team. I think that was a really good debate, and I really like there was a kind of all the different points were really put
very
forward
good, very good. Well,
eloquently.
Can we have a round of applause, please, for our speakers? Thank you very much.